Rania, I want to just get into it here with our
Yeah.
first guest, just dive right in. We are very happy to be joined here by the investigative journalist David Sheen as we start the show out here, turning, of course, to what I think many people have been seeing around the world in the aftermath of the war in Gaza, the changes in the Israeli government or alleged changes. David, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thanks for having me, Eugene.
So, David,
please, Rania, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's just get right into it. Why don't you start off by giving us an idea of what the latest is with the Israeli political games we've been watching? When do we find out who the next prime minister is? And does it really matter? Will it change anything in terms of the direction of Israel?
Okay. Well, we've got, 72 hours until we expect to have a new prime minister. Finally, after 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu in office, it doesn't seem like he have any more dirty tricks up his sleeve. This is it. We only have a couple more days to wait on this. So what awaits us now? Is going to be any different, if anything? So the new prime minister is actually not the leader of the next biggest party. The next prime minister is in a shared power sharing agreement with that person, the person with the next largest party. The next prime minister is someone who only has 6 seats, maybe, in parliament out of 120, 5% of the electorate. How is it that Naftali Bennett is going to be Israel's next prime minister? Well, it's because he holds a pivotal position, which is he's on the border between Israel's largest political camp, the nationalists, let's say, those who support one apartheid state from the river to the sea, and the next largest camp, which is the eliminationist parties, the eliminationist camp, the religious parties who want that one apartheid state to be ethnically cleansed of non-Jews, ultimately. So Bennett is the head of the party that is just at the verge between the two. He's in the religious camp, the eliminationist camp, but not as extreme, let's say. He's somewhere on the border there. And because of that, those votes are pivotal, because for Netanyahu to have power all these last couple of years, as he's, finally being taken to court, not for the war crimes that he's committed in Gaza or, against African people or against Palestinian people, but rather against Israeli taxpayers, corruption crimes and manipulating the media. So as he's about to head to jail for that, we have a situation where all of his political partners that are secular, that are like him, nationalists, drop away, and he has only the religious parties left. So they needed one of those religious parties to complete the opposition. To get Netanyahu out, they needed at least one of those natural partners that Netanyahu has relied on all these years to stay in power. And so that's why this man with so few seats is going to be prime minister. What does this mean? It's Israel's first openly eliminationist prime minister. And what that'll mean? Well, in his own words, he said that when, of course, being attacked, Netanyahu was trying to outflank him from the right, saying, you're going to be a leftist government. You've got leftists in your government and such. He said, well, my government will be 10 degrees to the right of Netanyahu. So he's openly saying, I'm going to be more right-wing than Netanyahu. As I said, the eliminationist camp is who he represents at the head of. And just as an example of what that means, elimination light, to be not as extreme as some of the other members of his camp who would openly admit, yes, we need to ethnically cleanse the country of non-Jews. He will still promote a policy that ultimately would see that, but he would couch it in either religious terms or in hasbara terms. Since he spent many years growing up in English, like Netanyahu, he has that eloquent speech. And so what he would say is that all those kids who died in Gaza in 2014, at the time he said that Hamas was committing self-genocide. So he was admitting that Israel was genociding the Palestinian people in Gaza, but he was just saying that the blame for that was not on the government who was shooting those rockets or artillery. It was the government in Gaza that was responsible for that genocide. So this is what it means to have as prime minister someone who is an eliminationist 10 degrees to the right of Netanyahu. And like I said, it's a power sharing agreement.
I also want to remind.
Go ahead. Yeah, of course.
I also wanted to remind viewers with Naftali Bennett, who you're talking about, he also openly bragged about killing a lot of Arabs and said there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I guess that shouldn't be too surprising. It's kind of like that is what makes you more popular, I guess, in Israeli politics. But he actually openly stated that, right?
Open our history books. Let's look at what happened in 1996. I don't want to go back too far, but we're talking about 25 years ago. But at the time when Bennett was in the army and actually killing Arabs, at that time, he called in an artillery strike to defend his position, which was inside southern Lebanon. And the Israeli army did so. And in doing so, killed 100 plus civilians who were being sheltered in a United Nations camp in southern Lebanon. So he literally has Arab people's blood on his hands. It's no exaggeration to say so. Right. This is Naftali Bennett. Shall we say a couple words about his power-sharing prime minister, or where y'all want to go?
Yes.
No,
go
please.
ahead.
I'm honestly still stunned about that story. Oh my God.
Ooh, and he's sharing. It's interesting. He'll be sharing power with somebody who, the Americans are probably happy about, because he's in the American point of view, from the American government's point of view, a liberal. So go ahead and tell our viewers about who Naftali Bennett will be sharing power with should he become prime minister.
You're so right, Rania. That's exactly it. In fact, the person who will be his foreign minister for the next 2 years and then eventually succeed Bennett as prime minister if everything goes as planned. Who knows if that'll happen, but if it does, the next prime minister after Bennett will be Yair Lapid, the head of the Yesh Atid party, with the next largest party in parliament after Netanyahu's ruling Likud party, or up to now ruling Likud party. And so you said that, in fact, the Biden White House will be happy, and they will. They already have shared advisors who advise both of those, both the Biden White House and Yair Lapid's parties. So it's obviously it's going to be very welcomed. And in fact, one thing that we can say about him is, just as how after Trump was finally, put out to pasture by the American people, instead of cleaning house and saying, okay, we need to have what we had, there needs to be like a total, complete ejection of anything that anyone that had to do anything with Trumpism, has to have no possible connection to any, power position ever again. So instead of doing that, he's like, no, we got to come together as a nation, bygones be bygones and all that. So the same thing with Yair Lapid, like one of the only, we can call them progressive activist groups in the country, Mechaskim, they were like, yes, finally Netanyahu's out. Let's fill Tel Aviv City Hall. There's like a big fountain in front of it. Let's fill it with water. And then as soon as Netanyahu's out, wow, we all jump in and jump around, have a big ass party. So, and when you're Lapid, the next prime minister after Bennett, when he heard about this, the Biden type, he's just like, no, we got to come together. We're not going to be filling up the pool. Like, God, we've been waiting for so long for this evil asshole to be out of power. At least let us have that, But no, we got to pull the country together, and so that's his vision, very Bidenian vision of the country. And as Israel's foreign minister, as Naftali Bennett's foreign minister in the next couple of years, he's going to be doing that. Going to everywhere in the world saying, "Don't worry, Netanyahu-ism is over, Trump-ism is over. We'll continue pretty much the exact same policies, even 10 degrees to the right, but." Don't worry, you can trust us again. We're not guilty of war crimes. You can allow us to continue doing those war crimes willy-nilly. Please don't look here. That'll be Lapid's position for the next 2 years.
Wow. Well, so it sounds like ultimately, at least for Palestinians, nothing really changes. Like the policies stay the same, right? And that said, since you're talking about 72 hours here, I mean, can Netanyahu still pull a rabbit out of a hat? He hasn't seemed to have really given up. At least he's acting like he hasn't given up yet.
Wow.
Is it really over
No,
for
he's
him?
tried everything.
And ultimately, there's nothing else he can do. It's over.
Mm-hmm. Well, in recent days, he's really pulled out all the stops. And I'll give you just an example, a sample of what that might mean. So as you may have heard, Israel's prime minister from 25 years ago was assassinated, Yitzhak Rabin, and he was assassinated because at that time they were starting to see if it would be possible to create some kind of what they thought might be a two-state solution. It turned into something grotesquely different from that, and even in the best case scenario. But the point was that because this Israeli prime minister took a step out of the mainstream idea of, perpetual apartheid and said, let's have a two-state solution, give Palestinians just a quarter of the land of, historic Palestine. For that, he was assassinated. And he was assassinated because the eliminationist camp, the rabbis who lead the eliminationist camp, that's 20% of the Israeli electorate, they incited so much against the prime minister to the point that some rabbis were saying, it's a mitzvah, it's a good deed. It's like, it's a commandment from God to kill this prime minister because he's killing us, So because in Israel, you can incite as long as you use religious language. There are hate crimes, there is hate speech, there are rules on the book that prohibit it. But if you use religious language to do so, you're basically exempt from those rules. So you can do so to the point of inciting murder, even of a prime minister. So in recent days, we have the same kinds of ritual curses, Kabbalistic curses being performed and published about Bennett, even though he is the head of the eliminationist camp. But just because it will mean that some members of the eliminationist camp, some of the religious parties, the most extreme versions of them, will not have their hand at the till for the next couple of years, will not be able to keep, taking government funds for their religious projects. So for that, they are wishing death on Naftali Bennett, the head of the eliminationist camp, saying, take off your skull cap, take off your kippah, take off your skull cap. You're not really Jewish. You're not really religious. You're not good enough. And like I said, Netanyahu's been telling these rabbis, it's straight up reported in Israeli media, what they did to Moses when his leadership was challenged. And according to the fictitious literature called the Torah, in those stories of Hebrew literature, when Moses was challenged by Korach, then, according to, Yahweh killed Korach and his followers. So that's what Netanyahu is saying. Like, yeah, what happens? These guys got to die. They need to be killed. And this kind of discourse is what Netanyahu's come to. And it's not only that, he's also allowed the Kahanists, the Jewish political party that has murdered over 60 Palestinians in the last half century, it allowed them to run willy-nilly and to incite the streets and to organize race rallies and to, perpetuate anti-Palestinian pogroms, as we saw last month. So even all those efforts that Netanyahu is really pulling out all the stops to try to, turn the country into a feeding frenzy of, fear, where everyone's like, okay, Netanyahu's the only thing we know. He's stable. He's been leader. Let's just stick with him. Even like every trick in the book hasn't worked. Of course, it's succeeded in, escalating the inter-ethnic tensions in the country to stratospheric levels. Where, of course, even before this, it was at stratospheric levels, but now even more so. Right. So that he's been very successful. But in terms of being able to leverage that to stay in power, even that didn't work in the end. Seemingly, Netanyahu in the last couple of days has said, well, it's time for me to position. He's not going anywhere. His party hasn't kicked him out yet. He'll continue to lead the opposition as the leader of the largest party, but that's what we're going from now in.
It's with Naftali Bennett, one thing I find interesting about him is that he is the son of two Americans from San Francisco who moved to Israel. Essentially, like they settled in Israel. They're essentially settlers. And he is like the product of that. And that just, he kind of is the embodiment of the kind of Israel that some people in the US prefer not to admit to. For some reason, Netanyahu is seen as like being maybe less extreme as him, but it almost sounds like what you're saying is Netanyahu in some ways is a bit more extreme, particularly with the alliances that he made. But David, I'm curious, what's the impact with all this happening? What's been the impact of the war on Gaza in popular opinion? Are people even talking about it, or is it just like completely in the rearview mirror? Was there anything about the aftermath of this war that's been different, at least in Israeli society, and particularly in terms of the aftermath of this, I guess, this internal uprising of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and the sort of communal violence that went along with that? Is there any discussion or reflection, whether positive or negative, about that in Israeli Jewish society?
Okay. Well, truth to tell, most of the inner discourse has been about this crazy election process that we've been going in. Palestinian lives do not matter much, even when in recent days, we've been reading about insane pogroms happening in the West Bank. I don't want to go into details. We could be all day on details, but like really, really over the top, disgusting stuff. And it's barely been a blip on the Israeli media. People aren't even registering it. So no, Palestinians are very far from people's minds. They're mainly focused on the politics. But to understand, it seems like what you're asking is about like if Naftali Bennett is the head of the eliminationists, blah, blah, blah. But what about the kind of the the mainstream or the consensus Israeli opinion or Jewish society in Israel. And I would say that we can look at a couple things to measure it, perhaps. So one of the things we saw this week was the election, not only, or the formation of a new government, but also the election of a president. Now, this doesn't exist in the US. You have a president, that's the leader of the country. Here it's the prime minister. The president is kind of like in Canada's governor general. It's mainly a figurative position, and they don't have a lot of power. They can, like the US president, they can lower someone's prison sentence and often do so. But besides that, it's mainly a ceremonial position. So who did Israeli Knesset members of the parliament, vote on to be Israel's president for the next 7 years? This just happened this week. The man they chose was the one who was the leader of the opposition to Netanyahu, the so-called liberal Zionist alternative. So the previous version of Yair Lapid from 2013 to 2018, the leader of the Labour Party, Isaac Herzog. So, this is you can't even pick a more consensus person. The votes they got were more than any previous election for president. In the Haaretz, there's a Haaretz article calling his family, the Camelot of Israel. It's more like the Windsor family of Israel. They never won an election. They're associated with colonialism. They're Irish Jews who moved here, and they, are thoroughly anti-miscegenation as much as the Kahanists are. Okay, it's like a multi-generational hate on mixed families that are Jewish and non-Jewish. One partner is Jewish, one partner is non-Jewish. Just as Isaac Herzog, a couple of years ago, the first day of his new job, leading the Jewish Agency, which is kind of a parastatal group that has ridiculously been called the Prime Minister of the Jews, like all Jews in the world. So for the last 3 years, according to Judaism, he's been the Prime Minister of the Jews in his own mind. And on his first day in office, as he leads his opposition in the Israeli parliament and becomes the head of the Prime Minister of the Jews, he says, we've got to stop miscegenation. I go to America to visit my friends there, Jewish friends that I met 20 years ago, and they're like, oh my God, their kids, some of them date non-Jews and some of them marry non-Jews and live with non-Jews. Oh my God, it's like every Jewish family. There's like millions of them. Like, oh my God, Jewish penises and non-Jewish vaginas, Jewish vaginas and non-Jewish penises. What are we going to do about it? We must find a solution. He called us a
This
plague.
is the liberal. This is the liberal.
This is the liberal alternative to
Wow.
Netanyahu for 5 years. Okay? So this level of over-the-top racism is 100% normalized in Israel. It's a consensus view that this is the nationalist camp. This is 60% of the Israeli electorate, to say nothing of the 20% of eliminations that are. So it's 80% who share this view. And it's so common that not only did, Isaac Herzog, push for this, on the day one of his new job, like advertising what he cares about so that people will feel better about him being prime minister of the Jews. Don't worry, I'm going to fight miscegenation. But, sickeningly, his grandfather, who he's named after, who was the chief rabbi in Palestine in the 1940s, he started like the 1940s version of Lehava, of these anti-miscegenation squads, the Committee for the Protection of the Honor of Jewish Women, and they would like make lists of which Jewesses were married to non-Jews. And these women, they made the death of them. They, harassed them, harangued them, they beat them, they tortured them. In some cases, they killed them. None of the people who ever participated in these like disgusting race attacks ever were investigated, let alone tried and convicted. Okay, so this is like multi-generational hate on mixed families. It's like racial purity is totally the normal ethic. So that's Israel-centered. And I think it's very instructive to understand who Israel just picked as its popular president. That gives you some insight into Israeli society. And we come to Bennett, the prime minister. Of course, he's supported anti-miscegenation efforts all these years. Is it any surprise if even the so-called liberal Zionists do so as well? Something to think about.
It's really, it's really disturbing. It's like every time, we have you on, it's always a pleasure to have you on, David, but it's always very disturbing because it just feels like there's no obstacles to prevent these goals these really eliminationist goals ultimately that most people seem to share, just perhaps they have different ideas about how to carry it out. That said, is there what can people, I guess, outside of Israel do? It seems like there's no checks within the country. So what can people who are horrified by what they're witnessing do, who are on the outside of all this, just like looking in disgust?
Well, I try to limit myself to try to, understand what I'm looking at and to convey that, as opposed to being, to give what I recommend that people would do. But I would agree in the sense that it seems that there's no levers. Yes, even if we have, let's say, I'll be generous, 20% of the electorate who wants to see a different direction, wants to pull back from this, descent, downwards, but that's not enough. 20% of the side. Of course, if everyone was counted, if all Palestinian people had equal rights, then it would be 50-50. People would have to come together, and there would be many more mixed families if we were allowed to have mixed families, and that was even a possibility in this semi-theocracy. But I think that, as you said, it needs to come from outside. Now, what do people outside need to do? It's very difficult because the discourse is dominated by people who gaslight anyone like yourselves who are, asking questions and showing a different perspective other than the Zionist narrative. This has been going on for decades. And so it doesn't seem that until, I can't imagine that in the near future. I think there's some people who are making great efforts at trying to bring, I'll just give you one small example. We talked about the anti-miscegenation movement just now. Well, the number one funder of Israel's anti-miscegenation squads, Lehava, is the same number one funder as those Death to the Arabs flag marches that we discussed in Jerusalem, the annual marches in Jerusalem, the Death to the Arabs marches, the same funder, and also that funder as Israel's prime minister for the last 12 years, Benjamin Netanyahu. All of these are their top funders of each of these are the phallic family. They're just a gajillionaire American Jewish family who funds all these, various levels of Israeli racism. And so just last week, I saw Jewish Voice for Peace, a progressive Jewish group in the United States, had a protest, also, with folks in solidarity with them, did a protest in front of the business that's owned by the phallic company. They own a large business, and they protested there in front of them to say, call them out. These people are funding apartheid, ethnic cleansing. These people are evil, and naming and shaming them. I think things like that could potentially, if we start calling out the racists, then that, starts to change the discourse. But it was a very, very small protest. Let's see 100, let's see 1,000, let's see more people out there in the streets protesting, pointing the fingers at the people who are funding this. Yes, there are plenty of racists on this side of the Atlantic, but a hell of a lot of people on your side, well, y'all side over there, Ranya's over here, but y'all side out there, you guys are there's so much money besides the political support in Congress. There's also a lot of funding that comes this way, and to be able to point back at those people, say this is what you're supporting, that could go a way to changing people's minds about it. I think most people don't realize the extent, partly because the discourse here is in Hebrew. I'm doing what I can to translate stuff into English, but ultimately, if I could plug for 1 second, I would just say that there is no media in this country that supports, let's say, a one-state vision, where they see everyone in the country as equal. They believe that the country should be shared by everyone equally. Everyone should have equal rights in the country. There are newspapers that promote the apartheid view, promote the ethnic cleansing view. We have Haaretz, Israel's only real broadsheet newspaper, and they represent the liberal view, the two-state solution view. But those who believe in a one-state solution, they don't have press, not in English, not in Arabic, not in Hebrew, not online, not in print, not in any fashion. So that just closes off many stories and also many opportunities to understand what's actually happening here. People need to people have to start funding that, in my humble opinion. But that's my little personal plug.
Well, David Sheen, investigative on-the-ground journalist, thank you once again for joining us on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News to give us a breakdown. David, one of the best journalists, especially for what's happening within Israel itself. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for having me.